Welcome to the Empowering Tomorrow's Automotive Software Podcast, brought to you by ETAS, a single source of cutting-edge software and hardware solutions that make automotive embedded systems safe, smart, secure, and sustainable. Each episode, we'll be joined by ETAS and industry experts to discuss how electrification, automation, and connectivity are impacting the automotive industry. Now, sit back and enjoy the discussion.
Hello, everyone. My name is Zane Pelletier. I will be your host today for ETAS's Empowering Tomorrow's Automotive Software podcast. I am a penetration tester and reverse engineer. I work at ETAS, primarily servicing the North American region for enterprise and embedded security. And joining me today is Kevin Mitchell, a senior automotive security tester also at ETAS. Kevin, do you want to give us a little bit of background on you?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Zane. My name is Kevin Mitchell. I am a senior automotive security tester here with ETAS, primarily focus on wireless penetration testing within vehicles, testing automotive embedded systems, ECUs, and protocols that are normally found within automotive vehicles or vehicles as a whole.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate it. So for those of you who don't know, we actually work together. The project that we're going to talk about today, we actually worked on, and this is going to be a little bit more of a discussion format. But before we jump into it, we're going to use one specific term a lot. And for those of you who don't have a background in security, I'd really like to explain this so people understand what we're talking about when we discuss it. So Kevin, can you let us know exactly what is a CVE? How do hackers use them? And what does it really mean to get a CVE officially recognized by the industry?
Yeah, for sure. So a CVE is a common vulnerabilities and exposures. It's pretty much a system that is maintained by the MITRE Corporation. And the common vulnerabilities and exposures, or CVEs, are pretty much just a classifications of vulnerabilities that are found either within public available software or hardware. And for a hacker, I would say once a hacker or cybersecurity professional discovers a vulnerability and it gets labeled with a CVE, that's kind of like the official accomplishment and the publishing for that vulnerability to making it public. So I would say what it means to a hacker or somebody like myself is you're just finally being recognized for all of the hard work that you put in with regards to penetration testing, all of your studies. And it's kind of like the formalization that you are, I don't want to say a real hacker, but a recognized hacker or bona fide.
Right. Definitely. Yeah, and just a quick addition to that, that was an excellent explanation. The way that I often like to illustrate it is CVE is kind of like open source software. It is essentially certain organizations, people that make embedded and enterprise systems can go and contract a group to perform penetration testing to find security vulnerabilities in their systems. But often CVEs are actually found by security researchers that are just going out there doing security research on a product or a system, and then contributing that proof of concept exploit that is the result of a CVE to the community, so that they can make whatever the product is or the system is more secure. And so, yeah, this is definitely a huge accomplishment, and I just want to say congratulations for that. This is really amazing to get something like that not only recognized but also work through the entire process.
Thank you very much for that, Zane. I really do appreciate it.
Yes, certainly. I think it would be a good time now to discuss the CVE that you found, exactly what you found in which system. And another thing that I think would be really important here is to illustrate the exact timeline, the series of events, and what exactly went down in terms of when you found the vulnerability, the issue, and then how the vendor that created the initial product that you found it in responded to your finding.
Yeah, for sure. So the title of the CVE is CVE hyphen 2023 hyphen 52709. The title of the CVE is the TI Bluetooth stack can fail to generate a resolvable random private address leading to denial of service for already peer bonded devices. So Texas Instruments is responsible for creating a Texas Instruments BLE 5 stack. And essentially, there's a denial of service vulnerability to where when you run a certain sequence of, uh, I guess, bytes against the device under test, you will produce a denial of service vulnerability, or you will put the device under test into a denial of service state where the device can no longer effectively communicate with other devices that have already been bonded to it previously. So we discovered this vulnerability while working on a internal project that had a similar setup to what was found in the wild. So as we perform our car hacking activities, we often run across vulnerabilities that we cannot disclose to the public. This was a different type of situation because initially we thought that the vulnerability that we had found was within the hardware of the device that we were testing itself. So once we actually escalated the issue upwards and to the original engineering manufacturer that we thought the vulnerability belonged to, they told us that, hey, this was not, in fact, their issue that they had created. Instead, it was from a supplier that they bought the system on chip from, which was Texas Instruments. And so they pointed us to get in contact with Texas Instruments, and this was around August of 2023. So we forwarded our information to Texas Instruments as long as the special test cases that we ran against the system. And in August of 2023, Texas Instruments acknowledged that they had received our vulnerability disclosure. And at the time, we hadn't known that it wasn't separate from the system on chip, and we really didn't have the insight to know that this was a Texas Instruments BLE 5 stack vulnerability. Instead, we had just, like I said, we thought it was just an issue on this one specific system on chip. And so once we got in contact with Texas Instruments, they contacted us back saying that they were unable to reproduce the issue. And so at this point in August of 2023, we're pretty much having daily updates and communications between the engineers within ETAS. Also, some Bosch engineers got involved, and Texas Instruments engineers were all kind of replying on this email chain. The next update, I replied to Texas Instruments with my exact test cases that I ran and how the testing setup was completed in order for us to run this exploit or exploit this vulnerability. And so I gave them instructions on how I was able to perform the denial of service attack. And then they came back and pretty much said, well, we tried what you did, and we're still unable to reproduce this issue. And so after a couple of emails going back and forth and us setting up meetings, there were a couple of Bosch engineers that were involved at the early stages of identifying this vulnerability. And they suggested that I test out the sequence of data that was actually being sent to the system on chip or the device under test at the time and see if I can procure a different device that is publicly available, which was called a Launchpad. It's pretty much a development unit that Texas Instruments has to allow developers to develop new applications using their same BLE 5 stack. So we procured a device that was in the wild that wasn't specific to an OEM, and we ran this, set of test cases on this device. And at the same time, I had TI or Texas Instruments engineers reaching out to me asking clarifying questions. So, long story short, I was able to run the same exact vulnerability and get an exploit on the development unit that the Bosch engineers said that we should test, and this was called a Texas Instruments Launchpad, and I believe it is a CC2642R1 and the CC2652R1. And like I said, it's pretty much just a development unit. And we're able to get this same type of behavior where any device that was previously bonded to this test unit or this development unit would no longer be able to communicate with it after this exploit or this vulnerability was run. So then we scheduled some meetings with some stakeholders. And then after we scheduled the meetings with the stakeholders, I was able to get on a call and demo the vulnerability to them. Shortly after that, I also had some boss engineers come into the ETAS office, and they were actually able to reproduce the issue. And then some boss engineers were able to communicate the differences between the testing setup that Texas Instruments was attempting to run in their environment and the differences that they had run in within their test setup. After a while, I want to say in November of 2023. So we have been working on this issue for about 3 months, back and forth. In November 2023, the Texas Instruments engineers were finally able to reproduce the issue on the CC26X2R1. And within a couple of weeks of them being able to reproduce the issue, they were able to send me and the rest of the team a root cause analysis for the vulnerability. And also, they had deployed a couple of different mitigating SDKs that would remediate this issue on their newer software versions. So I think that pretty much boils down like the timeline. But like I said, I want to say like the hardest thing for this was just the constant communication and constant back and forth and, setting up meetings with the responsible team members that could actually remediate the issue and showing them exactly how we were able to reproduce this issue, not only on the phone is key system so that we have found it on, but also within a publicly available system on chip, which is the CC26X2R1.
Right. And yeah, thank you for that, Kevin. That really, I think, illuminates exactly what went down. I do want to point out that at this point, you're not getting paid for any of this extra work that you're doing, right? All these meetings you're setting up, all these leads that you're chasing, all of the troubleshooting and the debugging. The original project you did was over, and now you're actually following up with the vendor of the Bluetooth chip themselves to track this down and help them figure out exactly what's going on. So this seems like a pretty arduous process that you went through to accomplish this, right?
Exactly, exactly. It definitely was. And, you know, I want to make the point is that we thought that we had just found a denial of service vulnerability within the project that ETAS was hired to do. And so once they told us that this went beyond a denial of service vulnerability for one specific system on chip, then it became out of the scope of the original project that we were working on. Then we were able to see that not only was this system on chip or the Bluetooth chip was being used in, I guess, private OEM settings, but also that this specific system on chip was being used in the wild. And so then that's when we had the delineation of it no longer like being a private project for an organization, but just being external security research that I felt it was, my duty to follow up on because now I have knowledge of a BLE stack that is available in the wild that multiple devices are using that might have a vulnerability. So then that's how we were able to move it from like being a private project to being able to disclose the CVE on a BLE stack that was used in multiple upwards of 20 plus devices.
Right, definitely. Yeah, and I do also want to zoom out a little bit here and look at it at a high level. What are the implications of this, right? So you have a Bluetooth chip with a software development kit that has a vulnerability in it. So that means that, right, whoever is using Texas Instruments chips on their devices and they're developing perhaps proprietary software on top of the software development kit that they provide, all of this has an underlying vulnerability on it where if you perform this exploit against it, you are essentially taking the system down. So for those of you who don't know, that's what a denial of service is. It basically is saying you are rendering the system non-functional to devices that should be able to connect to that system. So in this case, it's Bluetooth, right? I know there's a lot of Bluetooth 5 extended long range applications. I know that they're using them for things like drone communication and other things like that. If you had one of these chips in, let's say, a drone, and it was being used for some kind of communication, maybe not for flying it, but for transferring other types of data, you could potentially cut that entire communication channel by looping this exploit over and over again. Right. So this is actually a pretty big issue. And I would say in the field of offensive security, finding a denial of service like that is able to deny the availability of the device to already pair bonded devices is one of the most dangerous ones, especially when you're working with vehicles, systems where you're relying on these chips to get into the vehicle, perhaps where you're relying on other networks within the vehicle for driving, for braking, for ADAS functionality. These can have really big consequences if exploited in the wild by someone with malicious intent. So I just want to bring that all into perspective. I know there was a lot of technical details that you threw out, but that is the end result of what this vulnerability is able to achieve in the wild if somebody got their hands onto it that had, I would say, malicious intent, right? I know you touched on the number of devices that were affected. Can you give us an approximate like supply chain cost of how much stock is out there? TI has a bunch of chips that are ready to ship. They have a lot of SDKs. Can you just give us a couple metrics to understand exactly what is affected here in terms of overall stock and the software?
Yeah, for sure. So the initial assessment that we performed on these devices, we only had found that there were about 19 different system on chips or chips that TI was manufacturing that was able to run this vulnerable TI BLE 5 stack. So after some more assessment, they came back and gave us a list of about 28 different devices. And so you can do a search on the TexasInstruments.com website, and you can search their inventory for specific units. So that's exactly what we did. We searched their inventory for each one of these 28 devices that were vulnerable. And the initial amount of inventory that they had was around $2.6 million in inventory, equaling about about 2.6 million units themselves. So after a couple of months, we did the same assessment on the list and found that now there was closer to around 2.3 million devices that were listed on the website. And those 2.3 million devices that were listed were now at an inventory at around $8.4 million. And so I like to look at this as a pre-production cost of vulnerabilities according to OEMs. So an OEM might purchase one of these chips from Texas Instruments, and once they purchase a chip, they might have their development team work on developing an application. And so you have to account for all of the man hours that are put into developing an application that you can put on this TI BLE 5 stack. And then you also have to incorporate like the amount of the device that is actually being sold. So what is the dollar value of the vehicle that is holding one of these vulnerable chips that's vulnerable to this specific exploit? And so the $8.4 million is just the cost that it would cost Texas Instruments to, I guess is more like an MSRP value, like what is actually being sold and the amount of value that the inventory carries before it's actually sold to the OEM. Another thing that you had brought up was the fact that if you run this vulnerability, or if you try to exploit this vulnerability on a vehicle, right? I like to use this analogy. If you're using your phone as a key because for some reason you left your real phone or you left your real key behind, and now all you have is your phone as a key. You are at the supermarket and you've got your puppy with you, and you don't want to bring the puppy into the store. Roll down the windows a little bit and you lock the car using your phone as a key. When you walk away, a malicious actor comes up and runs this vulnerability and exploits the system on chip. And now your phone as a key is no longer able to work because it's lost the communication, and it has no service, or all the services that are typically provided to your phone as a key, they're in a state of denial of service. So you have no access to those services. So when you come back, you try to unlock your car, you can't get into your car. And the interesting thing that we found was that once you run the attack, the only way to get the system on chip to behave normally is by performing a hard reset. But if you're locked outside of your vehicle, how can you perform a hard reset on your vehicle unless
Right,
you're
you
going
got
to
to
cause
break
some.
in at that point.
Exactly,
And then you're
exactly.
already in the car.
And then you're already in the car. Exactly. So
Right.
the damage is kind of already done there. But then if we look at other other industries that this vulnerability actually impacts, there's consumer electronics that the different system on chips are being used in. So there's like a CC2540, a CC2541. These are pretty much being used in like keyboards and mice and audio devices. And then you have smart and home, or smart home and building automation. So some of these chips are being used for smart lighting and HVAC controls. Then you have automotive, kind of what we already talked about before, being used for keyless entry, and then tire pressure monitoring systems as well as like key fobs. And then we have industrial IoT, medical and healthcare devices. Some of those devices are heart rate monitors, glucose meters, and then you have energy and utilities, so smart metering. And this vulnerability touches a lot of different industries. And so we really haven't had the opportunity to analyze the potential impact that this vulnerability might carry for each one of these industries, as we are primarily focused on automotive cybersecurity. That's what we were able to identify the most. But like I said, it impacts retail systems, transportation and logistics, smart cities, and agriculture. So if we did like more of a deep dive into this vulnerability, we might find that it impacts, obviously more than $8.4 million worth of internal inventory for Texas Instruments. That number might be larger, according to the multiple industries that this medium level severity vulnerability touches.
Right. And I don't think that it's possible for any one security researcher, because to verify if this is an issue on all those different proprietary stacks, right? This is a combination of hardware and of a software development kit, right? So this software development kit is sold by Texas Instruments, not the SDK itself, but the actual chip. And then you can build your own software on top of it. So really, to verify whether or not this denial of service vulnerability is present on each device, you'd actually have to purchase one and go through the process of exploiting it to really determine whether or not it is vulnerable. And I don't think any one person can do that. I think that a really good start that I know that I worked with you on was being able to publish the exploit publicly, right? So it's available to everyone on GitHub, and anybody can use this exploit. Anybody can download it and use it to determine if a device is vulnerable or not, and to actually exploit a device. Now, that's kind of a mixed bag, right? Because we're basically giving someone a tool to do the hacking that we are trying to stop. But the goal here, I think, is that this has already been disclosed at a high level, and giving the tool to people that are able to fix the systems themselves, I think will do more good than bad, because at this point, it's still vulnerable. People know that it's vulnerable. Giving them a tool to determine if they need to fix it, I think, is a really important thing. So that's also, I think, a part of the process that I know that we went through to try to submit this to repositories like ExploitDB from OffSec, and have it be publicly available. So I do also want to ask you, if somebody out there, a security researcher, a penetration tester who's currently in the field, whether it's embedded, enterprise, whatever domain they're working in, what would you advise that they do if they find something similar to what you did, where you had a hunch that this went deeper than you thought it did originally on the project, and you actually reached out to the vendor and you coordinated that whole process? Is there something that, if you were able to talk to yourself, a year ago and give yourself advice, what exactly would you say, and how would you recommend somebody goes through this process if they were to do something similar today?
Yeah, I would say the advice I would give myself is to make sure that I stay persistent with my attempts to communicate the importance of this vulnerability. Also, staying level headed in making sure that you are communicating with your chain of command. What happens normally in a situation like this, you might reach out to the responsible party or the responsible company who you have discovered like a vulnerability on one of their systems or on one of their devices, and sometimes they might stonewall you, or you might not ever get a confirmation that they received and acknowledged the vulnerability. So with me, this was specifically important because I have my CISSP, and I guess one of the tenets of the CISSP is making sure that you are upholding the public trust. And I look at it as making sure that I'm not doing anything with my talents or my skills, especially when it comes to hacking, that could damage public infrastructure. So, at the forefront of my mind is obviously I want to pursue getting my work published, and filing for a CVE is kind of the beginning of that. But you also need to make sure that it's not going to cause any impact to industries. It's not going to make companies lose a bunch of money, or it's not going to cause havoc in any industry. So, like I said, I think the main thing is sometimes you'll reach out to the responsible party and they won't acknowledge you. And so you might have to move your communication up the chain of command. And then after they have acknowledged your vulnerability, they might not be able to reproduce it. And this is one thing I will say Texas Instruments did very well. They communicated with me after each email that I sent out. I received a response that same day. They did a very good job at communicating where they were not able to reproduce the issue. And even the management from their side really worked with me and was able to reach out to me and schedule meetings and had replies for all of the questions and all of my follow-up questions that I had for them, especially once they saw after a couple of emails that their engineers were not able to reproduce it. They didn't sweep it underneath the rug. They continued to try to figure out why they couldn't reproduce the issue. And that takes a level of dedication, because what's really important about this process, and I guess one thing you might not know if you don't go through the process, is each company and organizations, they all define their own responsible disclosure time frame. So responsible disclosure is pretty much what happens when you have a vulnerability. The responsible disclosure period for Texas Instruments was about 6 months. So from the time I disclosed the vulnerability and they were actually able to reproduce it, responsibly disclosing this vulnerability means that I gave them, or I worked with them in order to give them about 6 months worth of time in order for them to perform any patches, and publish any remediating or mitigating SDKs and come up with new software versions that didn't have this vulnerability. So while there is a issue or public vulnerability that is impacting a system, you still have to be responsible about the way that you actually disclose that information. And I would say that was the hardest point, because we acknowledged that, or Texas Instruments acknowledged that they found this issue, or they acknowledged the receipt of our vulnerability in August of 2023. But then they were not able to reproduce it until November of 2023. That is when the responsible disclosure period started. So 6 months after November 2023, I was able to coordinate with Bosch, and in May of 2024 is when Bosch first publish the vulnerability, even though, myself, Bosch as an organization, or at least Bosch product security information response team, at least, or incident response team, at least they were aware of the issue relatively early on. And so was Texas Instruments, but we all waited for that responsible disclosure period to be over with before they published and before I started to speak about this. So I would say that's probably like the biggest thing. Is just making sure that you are being responsible in the way that you disclose it, and also having some patience, because we're talking about, organizations that are spending millions of dollars on either software, firmware, hardware, and making sure that their products are safe and secure. And we don't want to disrespect that process and minimize that process by, shouting to the world about a vulnerability that we found. So I would say persistence, consistency, and patience.
Definitely. And I do want to jump in and say that I think that the advice that you gave is crucial to being able to successfully, orchestrate doing something of this scale. I don't think that it's only useful to just seasoned security professionals. I think that this is something that you can take if you are just breaking into security, if you are, aspiring to become a penetration tester, or you're working with embedded or vehicle systems already, but you're only just breaking into it. I think that this is something that is, I would say it's not just something you can add to your resume. You do get very important skill sets from publishing and doing the security research and publishing the CVE, and then also working to get the exploit code out there. And just the communication skills alone from orchestrating something like that, I think is invaluable to many organizations. So this is definitely something, and I know it can be really daunting if you're first starting to get into security. I know it was for me, where the thought is I could never find a CVE, right? It's not something that I can do with my skill set, because it's so incredibly difficult to. It seemed like the peak of the mountain, right? You've summited and you're all the way at the top, and you got to work your way to get up there first. But I don't think that that's necessarily the case in this current threat landscape. I think that people with relatively fresh skill sets do have the ability to use tools at their disposal to find things like this. I mean, the tool that you used to find this vulnerability was publicly available. Really, Texas Instruments could have used the tool to find the vulnerability themselves. They just didn't, right? You were just the one who used the tool at the right time, and you had the persistence to follow it up and say, no, this is an issue. We need to follow up with it. I think that that's a really important message for really anybody listening to this, that is either trying to get into embedded cybersecurity, or is already there and is trying to enhance their skill set to some degree.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I guess one thing that kind of popped up while you were speaking is I don't think on this episode we've really went over how the vulnerability was found specifically, and then the exact test sequence that the vulnerability kind of exposes. So you were saying that Texas Instruments could have used this tool, and other people in the industry who have developed systems using any one of these 28 different Texas Instruments devices, they also had the opportunity to test this vulnerability before in the past. I think one thing to note is that while we were running these scans on the system on chip, whenever we would see what we would call a denial of service state, the device itself would still broadcast what seemed to be a MAC address. But the MAC address that was being broadcasted always had like the same last two octets. And so we knew that it was failing, but it didn't seem like the device was actually offline. We just thought that it had a different MAC address. And so, doing a really quick deep dive into this vulnerability, it happens when the device under test, which would be the Texas Instruments device, would listen and advertise its MAC address waiting for connections. And with the phone as a key system, this is pretty important that it's always advertising and waiting for the connection, because the moment that your phone gets within range, you want it to be able to unlock your car. If you're walking up to your car, you don't want to necessarily have to hit the unlock button. It's like if you ever knew a vehicle, you're walking up to your vehicle, your phone is the key. As the moment you touch the door handle, the vehicle should be unlocking. And this is kind of the very unique way that this system is working, just because it's always listening, it's always ready for connection, because the availability is the thing that is important for this system. So this also is the one of the primary reasons why the system is vulnerable, because it's always waiting and listening for a connection. And the way that the specification works is, if there is a MAC address and you attempt to pair a device using that specific MAC address, and for some reason the pairing works and the device is actually paired, if you try to pair a different device to that device while it's already paired and it fails the encryption, the MAC address will automatically be discarded. And so what you can do is essentially you can you can send packets to the device that will fail encryption. And once that encryption fails, the MAC address will be cycled. So all you need to do is just keep sending packets to the device under test that will make the MAC address continue to be discarded. So it will go through a list of MAC addresses that it already has and can calculate and can pre-configure, and eventually there will not be enough memory on the chip to create new MAC addresses. And so it will stay in this state of denial of service until the chip is reset. And so in a phone as a key system, it's always waiting for your phone to be the key and to connect to the vehicle. So the vulnerability works just by sending it failed encryption packets over and over again, and then that phone won't be able to connect to the Bluetooth chip. So I like to say that I think, when the application developers were actually developing this, they developed it according to spec. It does everything it's supposed to do. But I think the major problem of the vulnerability is that especially with the phone as key system, the vehicle always needs to be advertising its Bluetooth MAC address so that the phone can connect to it. And that is the behavior that makes it vulnerable. I just wanted to throw that out there just because I know as we were talking, we really didn't talk about exactly how the vulnerability works and why it fails. So I did just want to circle back to that.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of background required to understand some of these things. So thank you for that, Kevin. I think it's time to wrap up now. So I want to thank you, Kevin, for joining me today and having this discussion. I really appreciate it. Do you have any last thoughts you want to share on this topic?
Um, yeah, when you first get into the industry, you have, especially as a hacker or a cybersecurity tester, there might be goals that you might want to accomplish. I know, Zane, you recently applied for a patent, and I believe you're going to be being issued your second patent. And so when I was getting into, cybersecurity, maybe about 10 years ago, I always wanted to have a public vulnerability. And so there were definitely times in the past where I was working on private projects and found a vulnerability that was so ridiculous. I wish I could, tell people about it. But in those circumstances, you have the obligation of making sure that you're putting your employer first and that you're not ruining their reputation and also not ruining your career by talking about things that you're not supposed to be talking about. So, with this vulnerability specifically, it was a similar situation, but the fact is that these devices were being used in environments that were not applicable to the contract that I was working on. So, I'm saying all this to say that make sure that when there is a vulnerability that you're doing it the right way, that you're reporting it the right way and having that responsible disclosure. And, I've been doing automotive cybersecurity since 2016, right after the popular Jeep hack. And now it's 2024 and my first CVE is being published. I'm not saying that it always takes about 8 years in people's cases, but there is a lot of things that you might have to plug away at. You might be working in your industry for a while before you actually get recognized. And then also, it might come a lot easier. So I would say just making sure that you, as a cybersecurity professional, as an ethical hacker, are being diligent in your work and also being responsible, because, I'm sure we all see pretty cool vulnerabilities and hacks, and we want to tell everybody about them. But when it's you who are actually finding the vulnerability, you have a different responsibility to share that information correctly. That's the last point I want to make. But like I said, make sure that you're always plugging away at it, and also make sure that you're passionate about what you're doing, because I think if you're passionate about what you're doing, that will be like your guiding compass in order to make sure that you're doing things the correct way.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kevin. Well, this concludes our episode with Senior Automotive Security Tester Kevin Mitchell. Thank you for tuning in, and please be sure to check back soon for a new episode.
Thank you for joining this episode of the Empowering Tomorrow's Automotive Software podcast. Please leave a comment or review with your feedback or what you'd like to hear in future episodes. To learn more about automotive embedded systems and ETAS's capabilities, visit our website at ETAS. That's ETAS.com.